Hey guys, so my friends, part two of this exploration of network society, network culture, and participatory culture. I just want to get a bit more into participatory culture and then kind of launch a full frontal attack on it, which is kind of my style, right? So, participatory culture. Let's get more into what Jenkins means by participatory culture, and hopefully it'll give you some indications of how much utility and usage this might have for you as you embark on your own projects. Jenkins defines participatory culture as a culture in which fans and other consumers are invited to actively participate in the creation and circulation of new content. This is why I think it's important to use participatory culture in this module, because really he is kind of directly describing the last 10 years of social media, where people are invited to actively participate in the creation and circulation of new content. The platform itself affords us that opportunity, and the way that we can engage with people on social media means that we can be in part of this culture, right? It also involves participants who interact with each other, social media, right? And participation involves for Jenkins new forms of participation and collaboration. Again, this is really suited towards social media. Now, Jenkins points out, based on Levy, that those who engage in participatory culture pool resources and combine skills so that collective intelligence emerges as an alternative source of media power. Now, that's a very important idea, actually, because that idea of a collective intelligence can be very much subverted via social media. If we think of fake news, and we think of the spreading of insane conspiracy theories like the QAnon conspiracy theory, for example, what you have in that instance is a sort of collective dumbness rather than collective intelligence. But people are very skillfully using this kind of information and implanting this kind of information around in order to spread their ideas further and gain legitimacy just simply by the numbers of people being used. So Jenkins narrows in on something, but he's quite positive about it. Now, what my point here is that this idea of a collective intelligence emerges. That intelligence doesn't need to be intelligent. It could be very stupid. And you look at kind of fads on social media, but indeed look at political sport for people like Donald Trump, for example, huge on social media, right? And there are problematic aspects of this as well, whereas Jenkins retains a positivity about participatory culture, that good things will happen if people cooperate with one another. And to an extent, I'm sympathetic with that view, but not to a huge extent. So Jenkins defines a participatory as a culture with relatively low barriers to artistic expression and civil engagement, strong support for creating and sharing creations with others. I think platforms like social media platforms do this. Some type of informal mentorship whereby what is known by the most experienced is passed along to novices. The idea of sort of copying others and seeing what their skill of doing things is important there. Members who believe that their contributions matter, and members who feel some degree of social connection with one another. At the least, they care about what other people think about what they've created. So I guess all those features exist within our social media cultures, is what I'm trying to argue here. When Jenkins lays out this part of this sort of thing, these are the things which we have to have in order for there to be a participatory culture. I think they all exist with regards to how we use social media. Now, participatory culture is not without its issues. So a problem of concepts like participatory culture is that participation actually in itself is a political science term that is strongly connected to participatory democracy theory and authors like Macpherson and Pateman. Now, for Jenkins, participation means that humans meet. For him, when he was writing on the net, I want to substitute that for social media. Form collectives, create and share content. He has a culturalistic understanding of participation and ignores the notion of participatory democracy, a term which has political, political, economic and cultural dimensions to it. He really doesn't talk about participatory democracy at all. Jenkins' definition and use of the term participatory culture therefore ignores aspects of participatory democracy. It ignores questions about the ownership of platforms and companies, which are extremely important for our purposes in this module, collective decision making, profit, class, and the distribution of material benefits. And these things are very important in terms of participation, because if one is communicating in a manner which marks out class as an important thing, one won't get the same traction. Perhaps a middle class person might have better traction on social media than a working class person, for example. There's no discussion of race in here or gender, which are very, very important variables in terms of how we participate. And Jenkins ignores these things. So participatory culture is kind of uniquely apolitical. It's not a political stance, it's an apolitical stance. It doesn't have politics embedded in it. For some people that might be a strength, but I think it's a distinct weakness, because social media is political. And I'm not just talking about content here, I'm talking about the whole structure of it has politics embedded in it. So these corporate platforms, which are owned by Facebook, Google, and other companies, strongly mediate the cultural expressions of us, people who use the internet, people who use social media. Neither the users nor the waged employees of Facebook, Google, and others determine the business decisions of those companies. We are not on the board. We don't participate at that level. We don't participate in economic decision making. We're excluded from it. And that's really, really problematic, because it says participatory culture is actually partial. So participation means that humans have the right and reality to be part of decisions and to govern and control the structures that affect them. That's not the case for social media. And possibly then the cultures that emerge from social media are also exclusionary in that way. They're created for us rather than we are a part of them, and we exist within them without playing a role in the shaping of them in the first place. Now, Jenkins' work very much concentrates on fan cultures. Now, Jenkins sees fan communities in general and online fan communities in particular as preparing the way for a more meaningful public culture. So he tends to idealize the notion of fan communities and the political potentials of them, and therefore cannot explain why these communities should make fans more interested and active in politics, for instance. He kind of has an ideal view of them, and it's that ideal view which is kind of positive in it. Now, fan cultures can be absolutely toxic. I suppose, like a number of you are watching this, I'm a football supporter, and football fan culture on social media is a toxic thing. It's absolutely horrendous a lot of the time. But even other sort of fan cultures, if you look at the kind of controversies that have raged with J.K. Rowling and her comments on trans people and the rights of trans people, I don't want to get involved in that discussion right now, but if you look at the toxicity of fan responses to both in support of and against J.K. Rowling, fan cultures are not necessarily just a positive thing. There's a lot of negativity which lists with them as well. So Jenkins idealizes this kind of group as saying this is the future for public culture, to have these well-meaning sort of contributory fan cultures out there. And he uses examples of things like fanfic communities and stuff, and the support networks which exist around them. I'll never forget reading fanfic and being given examples of fanfic when I worked in Ireland on One Direction. It warped me for life, and I thought, you really don't need a supportive community there. No, this is creepy. This is horrible. Get me out of here. He tends to idealize these kinds of communities, but still doesn't have any way of understanding the sort of politics underneath it. And indeed, he wouldn't consider things like support groups who are like Donald Trump, for example, to be fan cultures, but they quite clearly are. It is a form of fandom that goes on. So Jenkins mistakenly assumes an automatic connection with fandom in popular culture and political protest, I should say. He also mistakes politics with popular culture and sees politics as taking place largely as micro-politics within popular culture. To struggle of fans to make the culture industry respect their ideas and the design of plots, for example, he sees as politics. Politics is much bigger than that. Politics has power of its own. Politics forces power down on people, and Jenkins has nothing in his theories that explain this kind of thing. So the protesters who brought about a revolution in Egypt, for example, in 2011, to a certain extent, also made use of media like Facebook and Twitter for forming communities, not fan communities, but rather a political in community engaging in street protests, strikes, blockades, and the struggle against the regime. That's the kind of culture that can exist in social media. Jenkins has no idea of this. Participatory culture for him isn't that kind of participation. He doesn't really have any way of explaining this stuff, so his theory is kind of limited. Now, Christian Fuchs raises a number of interesting points about Jenkins. Is online fascism participatory culture, for example? So, cultural communities are not automatically politically progressive, is what Fuchs is arguing. An example is Document.no and a accompanying Facebooking group are gathering places for Norwegian right-wing extremists who oppose immigration to Norway and argue for advancing Islamophobia and the idea of cultural purity. The fascist terrorist Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people in 2011, was one of the active members of the community. Jenkins doesn't discuss any of this negative potential of online collaboration, and therefore misses a lot of what online communities actually are. So our notion of participatory culture, if you like, and participating in it, that we could take from Jenkins is not complete. It doesn't describe all forms of participation. Now, that might not be too important in the context of your project, but it is something you probably need to reflect on if you're going to use Jenkins to think about how your project puts together and how you are part of a participatory culture, that you can't explain some kinds of participatory culture. And although Jenkins to a certain extent is aware that corporations exert greater power than consumers, he focuses most of the reader's attention in most of his books on the presentation of hundreds of examples that want to assert the reader that contemporary media empower consumers because they enable production processes and the consumers successfully resist corporatism. Jenkins argues that increasingly the web has become a site of consumer participation and hardly gives any examples of corporate domination in culture on the internet, which is kind of bizarre because the fundamental building block of social media is corporate ownership. You know, we exist on social media, and social media exists to harvest information about us that can be sold on. You know, this is a fundamental model of it. Jenkins has nothing to say about this. And even when Jenkins was writing about sort of online communities in this way, this business model existed. It didn't fall out of the sky with Facebook. This was the model of how things were going. Google were already monetizing our usage of the web way before Facebook became big. So there's no doubt the Web 2.0 users are creative when they create and diffuse user-generated content, but the question is how many Web 2.0 users are active and what degree of activity and creativity do they have, and how is that conditioned by the platforms that we use? So scholars like Jenkins tend to overstate the creativity and activity of users on the web, and most of us aren't creative. You know, I'm not creative on the web. To be honest with you, I don't really create. You know, say a lot of mean things about people, but creativity is not, you know, it's a pretty poor form of creativity, right? Creativity is a force that enables internet prosumer commodification, the commodification and exploitation of the user's activities and the data they generate. Creativity is not outside or alongside exploitation on the web 2.0. It's not outside exploitation in social media. It's the foundation of exploitation. The creative urge of people on social media is the foundation of the social media business model. If people weren't doing that, there would be nothing to share. There would be no likes. There would be no comments. The world would be kind of dull, and social media would be very, very dull. But Jenkins really doesn't put the dots together here and think those creative outputs are actually being monetized by the companies that run social media. This is what we call platform economics. So capitalism itself is involved in a continual enrollment of new technologies to increase efficiencies and improve the processes of capital accumulation. What does that mean? Capitalism is always moving. It's always moving to new models. It's always moving to new things. And capitalism has changed over the past 20 years. It's become more intensive and it's become more successful as a political ideology, if you like, and an economic ideology. Social media are an example of these platforms as part of an eco-structure of data collection. Platforms position themselves as user-centric and have enrolled people into them and become part of people's everyday lives accordingly. And the word social associated with media implies the platforms are for users rather than just as participatory and emphasizes collaboration. But you can see where this is going, right? I'm going to argue very, very sharply here that this is not what is happening. Social media can be seen as online facilitators of networks. However, As a result of the interconnectedness of platforms, a new infrastructure has emerged, an ecosystem of collective media with few large and many small players, creating what we call a platform sociality, according to Van Dijk. This manifests itself in the forms of new media and the ownership models of new media, where vast profits are made from the exploitation of user-generated data, with a business model that avoids corporate taxes and a social responsibility attitude that avoids accountability for the actions of actors on platforms. We saw this in the US election, which is very recently finished when I'm talking here, and it's a bit longer in the memory now, I guess, when you're watching this. But you know, Facebook refusing to pull down Steve Bannon, for example. You know, Facebook refusing to do anything about QAnon conspiracy theorists because they're part of its money model. You know. And this is platform sociality, things which, you know, and in terms of Jenkins's idea of participatory culture, this is all aspects of participatory culture. It's spreadable media, you know, QAnon psychotics, that's spreadable media stuff, but there's no social responsibility with any of this. And Jenkins heavily implies that, you know, participatory culture would be positive, you know, it would be a good thing, and it would allow for progressive sort of thought to take root. That doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, platforms are being used for quite the opposite of progressive thought, you know, being used in particular by right-wing actors in order to spread messages around in a targeted fashion in order to influence the way people vote, for example. You know, this is not what Jenkins would think of things, but I think the reality of social media is quite different to what Jenkins contends. Increasingly, we're talking about platforms and the logic of the platform. The new normal is that platform and individual are inseparable. And in the work of the Invisible Committee, social media works to isolate everyone from everyone else, and we just become individual and platform rather than people connected to one another, which is kind of a dark image and dark sort of idea. It's also what I fundamentally agree with as well. If we look at platforms in this way, and I'm going to talk a lot more about Gert Lovink in lecture 4 of this module. Deleting Facebook and the others is as realistic as deleting roads in contemporary society for Lovink. And that's genuinely what he says, you know, getting rid of these things is about as realistic as getting rid of, you know, air. You couldn't do it. They are fundamentally part of our society. We're trapped inside these platforms. We're subject to meaningless cycles of social media events, cybernetic loops that go absolutely nowhere. And we live in a simulacrum, a simulation of reality. Networks are indeed are not there for pleasure, and Sean Parker, who founded Napster and is a Facebook president, basically confirms this sort of stuff for us. He talks about addiction by design, and social validation feedback loops that exploit vulnerabilities in human psychology are a fundamental part of how social media works. Snapchat, therefore, is like heroin because it works in exactly the same way in terms of neurotransmitters and feedback loops. You post a snap up, you get a reaction, that makes you feel good for a short while, then that wears off and you need to do it again and again and again and again until you're becoming completely addicted to the platform itself. Is this the kind of participatory culture that Jenkins was thinking about? No, but this is the reality of social media itself, and I'm going to talk a lot more about this in lecture 4 and these ideas. But really, in terms of the idea of participatory culture as being, you know, happy-go-lucky and so on, actually the platforms that we use to participate ourselves are designed to make us not feel very good. So Lovink basically argues that this thing which we call the dopamine hypothesis, this notion, you know, we're drug addicts and we need that burst of neurotransmitters, dopamine in particular, is the metaphor of our age, not the network and not participation. Neurotransmitter stands for the accelerated up cycles of our moods and the euphoric high before the inevitable crash. These constant psychological bursts keep you hooked, and according to Lovink, as a result, we are totally dead inside. It's very optimistic, right? You're really looking forward to lecture 4 now. Mood swings programmed by platforms designed for this task. Platforms themselves are built to do this, according to Gert Lovink. I agree with him. I really do. And that means participatory culture is really, really dangerous. Because what Jenkins sees as a very, very positive thing, others see as narcotic abuse by organizations against human beings. It's not quite the image that Jenkins has in mind when he talks about participatory culture. So, for Shep, culture of conformity, risk aversion, and social rigidity are the features of a social media culture. This digital oil, data, kills our environment. Miriam Rash, digital detox deals with the symptoms but not the pathology itself. Just getting rid of social media for a while ain't going to fix any of this. After engagements with likes and comments and text, we feel empty and indifferent, and that is designed for us. So we need to move on from network studies to platform studies. Platforms subordinate networks and their forms, e.g. blogs, for hypergrowth. It's an extractivist model. Networks are now second-order systems. Really what I'm getting at here is participatory culture and network culture perhaps are old ideas now, and platform studies has superseded them because platforms themselves have become primary. Platforms are comings together of code and community, if you like, and what we do exists on platforms. Indeed, when Jenkins was writing about participatory culture, he was really writing about the web rather than social media, and we don't use the web any longer. Our social media use is largely on phones, for example, and we have apps. Apps don't run on the web, they run on the internet, but they don't run on the World Wide Web. So the very model of accessing things has completely changed as well, and that's why I think platform studies is very, very important here. For Benjamin Bratton, when he talks about the stack, what we have in terms of these applications is planetary megastructures. Networks, media, and platforms no longer exist as separate entities. Everything is layered and connected, integrated into a much larger digital infrastructure, a universal grid, and platform sovereignty is the product of that. The platform exists outside of national boundaries, laws, etc. They just exist above that kind of thing in this planetary stack, which we are a part of as users. We have been enrolled into it, this giant socio-technical sort of stack of things which we form a part of. And for Bratton, this is a very, very difficult, this is obviously a negative thing. These things are so large and so monolithic that they can't be challenged. Their operations can't be challenged. And these things that make us sick and pathologically ill, with using social media cannot be challenged. Again, ideas like network society, platform, and participatory culture, they don't come close to this stuff. What are the effects of these things as we've moved from participatory culture to platformed sociality? We have the culture of narcissism. So following Lash, narcissism refers to a weak, ungrounded, defensive, insecure, manipulative self with no interest in the future, little in the past, indifferent and intentionally. A vacuum that constantly needs to be filled with the evidence of presence. I'm mean about Love Island, right? And one of the positives of the global pandemic was there was no Love Island this year. And oh my God, yes, sweet. And I have to watch Love Island because I'm a media lecturer. That's what people are watching. If you don't engage with the things that people are watching, what's the point of being a media lecturer? So I have to watch this stuff, and it's the worst. Weak, ungrounded, defensive, insecure, manipulative people. No interest in the future, little in the past, indifferent to everything unintentionally. It's not an intentional indifference as I don't care. It's just like, I don't know anything. Seems to me like everyone on Love Island is like that. That's why I hate the program. It's just this culture of narcissism. But those people are followed by everyone on social media. It becomes an inherent part of our culture. Is this what Jenkins meant by participatory culture? No, it wasn't. All those positive things Jenkins was saying about us cooperating and acting, actually, if we're becoming more narcissistic, we're following our role models, who are the very example of narcissism. This is really, really real problem, right? Now, what else can we say about this kind of cultural movement and these kind of theoretical ideas? The sharing economy would be an instance of, I think, where we could say participatory culture in action. We predominantly associate these things with companies like Airbnb, Uber, these sort of organizations. And regular critique is that the sharing economy has nothing to do with sharing. That's Nick John's critique from 2016. They're not platforms for sharing, but just for commerce organized between network users under the auspices of companies that take a cut. eBay works in this way too, right? So there's no sharing going on here. You don't share with your Uber driver. It's just, but that's how it was positioned at first. You're not sharing with Airbnb. This is just traditional commerce. So, organized through a particular network, which then takes a cut of everything off the top. The sharing economy is enabled by network technologies and turns us all into micro entrepreneurs. Those who are outside the networks have no value. Social networks have expanded the notion of sharing and enabled it to serve as a metaphor that can legitimize particular practices. Therefore, the idea of participatory culture and social media and sharing in general has legitimized really exploitative business practices. Sharing is seen as having an economic dimension thanks to the sharing economy. When we share content on social media, are we not part of this sharing economy or not? Well, we are. Now, this has been close to an end, okay? Just on the sharing economy, what I want to say is that that metaphor takes off from ideas like Jenkins's, but it's far different to what Jenkins would have considered sharing to be. Now, this is going to get more fun next week, I promise, when we look at selfies and things like that, because, you know, this is quite intense stuff and it can be quite difficult. But I think we need, just at this point, to have a look at the takeaways from this session. Networks are a key metaphor for understanding contemporary society. That metaphor has emerged from the advancement of computers and computational media in society. It's why we're studying social media cultures, right? Some people have aimed to show that this network metaphor can be used to explain society, and I think that's not very successful because some of the flaws that I went through in the last video and some more things I've talked about today. Social media are parts of or constitute networks of their own. So when we use social media, we're involved in a network and so are subject to the fundamental tension between the organization and our agency identified by Castells. Our social media use is therefore a continuing tension between our own aims, sharing, communicating, etc., and the economics of a networked society. A participatory culture and fan cultures are part of the network economy and are used for value by the companies that host them. And the platform economy is enabled by networks and operates as a way of exploiting our network use. The sharing economy may legitimize those platform economics, but value is always derived from social media use. So the network society then, and participatory culture cannot be thought of as apart from the economics, the platform economics which dominate contemporary society. So what are you supposed to take from this? Your social media use can never be thought of as apart from those things either. Everything you do on social media forms part of this economic model, and you have to have that in mind when you are planning your project. I mean, you don't have to get into it directly. Some of you will, but you don't have to. But you do have to have it bubbling away in your head. Always, you are part of this networked economics. You're part of this platform economics. And at some point, you're going to have to contend with that, probably in your reflective essay. So in conclusion, network theory isn't perfect, but it does ask critical questions of how the structure of the social media we use position us economically. For your projects, you'll need to consider that networks affect how you use social media, how you're positioned on social media, who and with whom you share information with, and who extracts value from that unpaid activity and labor that you do as a social media user. These are all questions that I want you to think about. As I said, it'll get more fun next week. We start talking about selfies and so on, and yeah, kind of narcissistic too, but narcissism can be fun as well as being grim. See you guys in the next video.